Hey guys, usually I would begin by reading a script or just looking at notes and explaining myself on why I think uh, our young writers are important. But let me just keep it real with you guys that we shouldn't have to be so formal when we're talking about our young writers. We should normalize talking about our young writers and the impact that we have as English teachers on our writers. So, with that being said, in today's channel episode, we're going to be discussing three issues that has uproared a lot of the students and educators in the English education field. And the one is argued by Gallagher that we should indeed use mentor texts when teaching writing and during the writing process, using mentor texts as a model and using them as a guideline for students to build off of when writing their own pieces. There's also a second point that we're going to be discussing, and it's this notion of the danger of using mentor texts, right? Increasing dependency of our students. And that is where I will discuss the imitation model. There's also a third worry, too, that I'm going to discuss. And the third main idea we're going to be discussing in this video today is the notion and the idea, as Coppola argues in my supplemental extra text for this week, redefining writing and writing workshop. So again, to keep this video more empathetic and to keep it more heartfelt, I'm not using a script. I'm not going to do that. Because we need to understand the importance of normalizing the type of discussions involving our young writers. So, point number one. Let's get to it. So, this is one of the biggest worries that I have coming into the English education world. And it's this notion of using this idea, right, of using mentor texts as models, right? So when we want our students to write poetry, we obviously read a poem and we teach that poem and we go over the craft, stanzas, writing strategies, so on and so forth. There are also other texts in terms of narrative or memoirs that we may teach so our students could understand how to craft that form or medium of writing. However, some questions and a worry that I think I have. I think using mentor texts, and just being serious with you all, right? I think using mentor texts is something that can really be beneficial into the English classroom. But there are questions that I still have, right, as a future educator, and some worries, and that is, how do I pick the right mentor text, right? How do I know if the mentor text that I choose is the right mentor text to choose? Because I may think that, for example, Harlem by Langston Hughes is a good representation of symbolism, whereas a student might not grasp it as well. So, how can I, in a sense, use a mentor text to where it can be applicable to all my students' abilities and skills, if you will? And I think what is important here is that using mentor texts is a good thing because it gives our students a model in what certain aspects of writing looks like actual on paper. However, it raises the concern of, how do I know if this mentor text is the right text? Right. And is this mentor text credible enough to even be teaching symbolism or to be teaching iambic pentameter and those things like that. So I think those are my biggest worries right now in terms of using mentor text. But I also agree with Gallagher, and I would argue, right, that using mentor text gives them a model. It gives students a segue or bridge to writing their own pieces. They have that layout, they have that expectation of what is expected already when they're given the assignment. However, it's this worry, right, that I have, and it's this notion of, and this is what Gallagher really says, he talks about really the balance, right, between using mentor text as models, like using model text, and also balancing that from dependency, student dependency on those texts. And I think what is important here is that we must be mindful that we got to have that balance. And I think that is important. I think that is sometimes overlooked. And I think if we want to beef it up a little bit, right, those who are familiar with Noden, who is also an educational philosopher, his book Image Grammar is phenomenal. I recommend purchasing it. He talks about imitation model. And he says how sometimes when we use model text to teach writing, students depend on that form of writing, right? And they begin to make their writing identical like the author. And that's what we want to try to avoid. I know it's better said than done, but what we want to avoid is making our young writers dependent on model text, right? We don't want them to think that this is the best way to write, that this is the only way to use simile or to use iambic pentameter or to use caesura or enjambment, right? I'm going to follow this author's way of writing because this is what's going to give me an A. And that's not what we want to be teaching our students in terms of writing. What we want to be teaching our students is, okay, looking at this model text that I'm teaching, right, and that we're reading together, what is the author doing good, right? You see, in terms of using simile, what is the author doing? This is what I want. You necessarily don't have to follow the order or more of the system in the way the author writes, right? But what is important is how it is used, right? And I think that is important because a lot of students like to imitate the craft of a lot of the model text that we use, even some of the models that we provide to students sometimes, like when we have a research paper or a poem or a short story that we've written and we share with the class to show them an example of a good narrative or a good poem, right? We see these different things and we don't think about it, right? We don't think that far of if our students are going to imitate our craft because they think that's the only way and standardized way. That is the only standardized way for them to write and get a good grade, right? And I think that is so apparent. And I think, right, if we really want to make connection with our class discussions, right, I remember when Sue said something about the 5-paragraph essay. That's another thing. Noden also brings up this notion of the stadia paragraph, right, where that's where it's not the traditional paragraph. It's a solid logical paragraph, but it doesn't follow that traditional still or till, right? Topic, sentence, evidence, analysis, and then link back to your topic sentence. It doesn't follow that traditional model or organization or system of things, right, in terms of paragraphing. And I think that's what we want to tell our students, that don't necessarily imitate the craft, right, or in more specific terms, the system in which it is written, but to use the mentor text as a way to see how certain things in writing, certain strategies and certain ideas and certain skills are used in this writing, right? So I think that is really important that we really need to really think about. And just touching furthermore on this imitation model, I really think that when we give students too many model texts and we don't allow them to really think, write, and learn from their mistakes in writing, because that's what the writing process is all about. It's about making mistakes, learning from them, and then growing from them, right? And that's where people fail to understand the difference between, right? You make the mistake, you learn that mistake, and you grow from that mistake, right? And I think we sort of eliminate that process when we use too many model texts, right? We want to give our students the ability to put themselves out there in their writing, you know? And I think that's something we really need to think about as future teachers, guys. Like, we're going into a weird stage in life where kids were off for like 2 years. And like, you know, if we give them a model text, they're going to think, okay, well, this is the way the teacher wants it to be written. No. We're just looking at the simile, characterization, stuff like that, so on and so forth, strategies and stuff to see how it is used. You don't have to write it in that exact same craft or system of things, right? And imitation model, I think, speaks highly on the notion of plagiarism too. Like, students are more likely to plagiarize when we heavily enforce using model text. Like, okay, this is how your paper should look like. This is how it should look like. This is how the research paper should look like. This is how the poem should look like. This is how the rhetorical analysis should look like. This is how the literary analysis paper should look like. You know, and we don't want to normalize and tell them that this is something that it must look like this. No, that is not the case. Not that it must look like this, but you must use the certain strategies that the model text use in that way in your own paper, right? And I think that's something we need to really, really, really think about when we start teaching writing. So a third thing that I really want to bring up and really discuss is this notion of redefining writing and the writing workshop, Cupola. This is from my supplemental resource text that I found online through the NCTE website. And she really touches on the idea of really bringing in a new insight in the way we workshop our young writers, right? And how our young writers workshop. And I think sometimes we sometimes teach the same workshopping activities, and we need to understand that each year we have a different set of students. We can't use, let's say we use the same strategy for 3 years. It's not going to work on a different group of students, right? Because every student has different abilities. Every student learns differently. And I think what we need to really think about here in terms of redefining writing and writing workshops, and I think this is what Cupola really hammers down on, and that is really being mindful on how we create those workshop spaces, right? We must understand that we need to give students time to reflect and time to really take in and soak and sink in what they did in their writing and what they need to grow, how they need to grow, and what things they should preserve and things that they should change in their writing. And I think it's very important for us to think about, okay, how can we do those things? How can we make sure that my student is not only just feeling like, okay, my teacher gave me back my paper, I got a peer review, edit it, and then, it handed back in and my teacher gives me a final grade. That's not, for me, writing workshop, right? Writing workshop is actually, I call it getting your hands dirty, right? Like really exploring and really looking through a more intellectual lens at your own writing, telling yourself, okay, I got a 94, right? I'm not going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to get mad because I didn't get 100, or because I'm not going to say, okay, well, maybe I should improve on this. It's much more than that, right? It's looking at really, okay, what are my strengths in writing? And how can I use those strengths to really beef up some of those weaknesses that I have? And I think that's important. And that is what we need to teach to our students. And I honestly think Coppola's onto something here when she says we need to remix or refresh or workshop the way we do writing workshops. And a way that she describes in the article that I think is really worth mentioning, something that I would do in my own classroom, is allowing students in terms of like writing workshop is like, for example, have the students, if they wrote a narrative piece, workshop it into more of a different medium. So basically, Coppola argues that we should really, in terms of writing workshop, look at when we teach different, like, for example, essays and poems. In the workshop process, we should encourage students to workshop and revise that writing piece into a different medium, if that makes sense, which allows our students the pathway to multimedia pedagogy, right? That's pedagogical strategies for us, right? And I think that is really important for us to really think about. And I just want to say here, and like me going off strictly my mind and no notes, no anything, right? This is just me being genuine as a future teacher, because it's again important for us to understand is that like we don't need this pre-scripted discussion, right? Because this is something we really need to focus on. And I think going back to Coppola's point about how we should workshop writing by allowing students to revise their writing through different writing mediums. So for example, if you teach or writing, if you have students revise a narrative, maybe have students create a comic medium of a graphic novel, a mini graphic novel medium of that narrative. Or for students who wrote poetry, have them workshop it and to create a more multimodal poem, or to create a poem where they're just like recording themselves. They create a video or something in that nature, something that involves them to really not just revise, but just think about the writing process itself, right? And just think about the intellectual process in their own writing and understanding, okay, these are my weaknesses, these are my strengths. Now, with these weaknesses, not how can I get better at these by preventing these weaknesses, but how can I use my strengths, right? And to get into tweaking and turning those weaknesses into strengths, if that makes sense, right? There's another idea that I think Coppola really argues, and that is this idea of just understanding our students as young writers. Because sometimes we expect students to come in writing like scholars. We should not have that expectation. Not saying they're not capable. But when we have that ingrained essence of our young writers coming in our classroom, we automatically set them up for failure. We automatically set them up for failure. And I think that is something to really point to. And I think just a last point to mention is that I truly believe that our young writers have the power to do anything, write or craft anything they put their minds to. And we've seen this with Deb Bertelsmann students. I mean, we've seen how creative and thoughtful and deep and some dark these pieces were. And I think sometimes we really discredit students for what they're capable of. And I think we don't see writing like that when we use too many model texts. Because students begin to hide their individuality inside their writing. And that is something that I am very against, right? Because I believe through students writing, that's where we get to know our students. Yes, we know our students through discussion, but that's how we get to know who our students are. Because students are able to get personal in writing. They're able to express their personality, their voice, their opinions, their beliefs, in their writing. And I think that is very important. And I think that is something we all need to think about going into student teaching. And that is understanding that, like, as English teachers, we must ask ourselves that our jobs is much more than just grading writing, right? It's making them more authentic, more creative, more reflective, and more growth mindset based writers. And that is so important, right? I think that is so, so, so important. So with that being said, thank you for listening and watching my purely sincere talk on the value of our young writers. Thank you and be well.